Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. Good evening. Tonight we are going to be presenting a pre-Yom Hazikaron lecture. Later this week is Yom Hazikaron, which is technically a memorial day not only for the soldiers who have fallen in the cause of the Jewish presence in the land of Israel in modern history, but also civilians who have lost their lives as well in that same struggle. And tonight we're going to focus on a non-soldier, a civilian, an individual whose life is one that we have a lot to learn from. It is, I would say, more than that, the way her family perpetuates her legacy is something that all of us are going to be able to learn from. We're very honored that we have with us at 3 a.m. Jerusalem time, I believe it's 3 a.m., Arnold Roth. Arnold is somebody who is an immigrant to Israel. He's from Australia by way of the United States, made his way to Israel. And tragically, in 2001, his daughter Malki was murdered in one of the most well-known of the terror attacks that took place during the Second Intifada of the Sparrows Pizzeria in downtown Jerusalem. Yesterday, Shabbos morning, typically we recite the Av HaRachamim prayer right before Musaf, but during this time period of the Omer, we not only do we say it on a regular Shabbos, but we even say it on a celebratory Shabbos, Shabbos Mevarchim, which is a Shabbos that blesses the Rosh Chodesh, which is coming up. And the reason for that is that this is a time period when Jews during medieval times were targeted in the First Crusades. And so it's a time of mourning for Jews throughout history who have lost their lives for living as Jews. And we are extremely grateful that Arnold, who was very gracious to agree to speak to us at this late hour in Israel. In our subsequent conversations, it turns out that something that I had actually known but forgotten about, which is that one of Arnold's daughters is actually married to a cousin of mine. So we have this mishpacha connection. He actually once visited Atlanta as well. I'm sure he'll tell us all about it. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Arnold to begin his presentation. During the presentation, do not hesitate in the chat to ask any questions. I'm going to monitor the chat. When the presentation is over, on behalf of those who have questions, I'll be presenting them to our speaker, and please God, we'll have an opportunity to hear from him in significant detail, as well as hear all of your questions that we will listen to right afterwards. So on that note, I'm going to spotlight Mr. Roth, and we'll let him begin the presentation. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Tendler. It would have been a pleasure to be here tonight if I'd managed to get some sleep beforehand, but I didn't. So it's not really a pleasure. It's more of an experience in trying to ensure that I don't come across sounding incoherent, and I'm counting on you to point out to me if I stray from the path. I'm going to be talking about two public dimensions of my life. But not because my life has significance, rather because in telling about them, I hope to actually throw some light on issues that I think have significance to thinking Jews, and issues that, for a variety of reasons, some of which we may touch on, aren't getting drawn to your attention in the more conventional ways. One of them concerns a painful and turbulent pursuit of justice. The other is about the life of my daughter Malki and what's been done these past nearly 20 years to honor and remember it. Speaking face to face is one of the few ways my wife Frimit and I have of informing people of the distressing things to which we are exposed in the course of pursuing justice. Why justice? Because a Jordanian woman, whose name I have to mention now in order to avoid confusion, but which doesn't bring me any pleasure at all, Ahlam Tamimi, is today the most wanted female fugitive alive, officially designated as an FBI most wanted terrorist, one of only 2 on that exclusive list. But it's more than her being free that is the core of our efforts. It's that her freedom has been achieved, as I will try to explain, by royal command. And since the royals in question are Jordanian, we've learned in the course of these last almost 10 years that there is a truly horrifying unwillingness on the part of major governments and other organizations, some closer to home, to challenge and overturn what Jordan has done and is doing. It's a work in progress, and what I have to do here today is briefly share the sequence of events, which is something of a saga. And I can only do this briefly because I very much want, within the time available, to get to the actual issues and to tell you how the spirit and the memory of my daughter Malki, who's now in the picture, lives on. We have 7 children. Frimet and I have 7 children, 6 of whom are alive today. All except Chaya, our youngest, are, Baruch Hashem, married and raising their own children. We're a relatively tight-knit family, and apart from during global pandemics, we enjoy being in each other's company very much. Malki was born, as I was, in Melbourne, Australia, some 2.5 years before we made Aliyah. Her being born into our family came after 3 boys and before 3 girls. Her 3 sisters were all born in Yerushalayim, where we live. From an early age, Malki had a very special way of understanding and enjoying people, of sensing when there was a need to reach out and help. I think she may have been the happiest person I've ever known. On the 9th of August 2001, which was school holidays and a very hot day, Malki and her best friend, who was the daughter of our next door neighbor, a young widow, left the house, left our apartment on the north side of Jerusalem in order to go decorate the bedroom of a mutual friend, a girl who was returning that day or the following day from the United States, where she'd been having summer vacation. They finished early enough that before their next mission, which was to go to a gathering of camp counselors, they were both madrichot, youth leaders in an organization called Ezra, rather similar to Bnei Akiva, but not present in the United States, to the best of my understanding. They were going to go to the summer camp planning session. The summer camp was a week later, and decided to stop off at their favorite place in the center of town, which was the Sbarro Pizzeria. And they were standing at the counter at the moment when a young man carrying a guitar case who'd been brought there from north of Jerusalem by the woman I've mentioned, Tamimi, walked right up to them, stood just behind them, and then pressed his button and destroyed the building and many, many lives. 15 people are reckoned in the death toll. 2 of those are American nationals. As you'll see, that's a key issue. A 3rd American woman remains unconscious until today. We're almost coming up to the 20-year mark. She was there with her toddler daughter. The daughter has grown up without a mother, is now a mother herself, and adds to the incredible toll of grief, of pain, and of loss, driven by an act which can only be described as being, well, it can be described in other ways too. There are plenty of people who would say driven by an act of heroism, but I would say driven by an act of satanic, bigoted, lethal hatred. I'm not going to spend any time talking here about the arrest and the trial and the sentence and then the release of Ahlam Tamimi, except to say that during the years that she was imprisoned after a trial at which she confessed with a big smile on her face to all of the charges, she became somewhat famous inside the Israeli prison system because, as a result of decisions that I've never been able to track down to any particular failure, but certainly failures there were, she was permitted to become the focus of media attention, even as a prisoner, even as a person serving 16 consecutive terms of life imprisonment. She managed to be interviewed, filmed, and appear on the front page of what was then called the art section of the New York Times. And as I recall it, it was the appearance of her grinning face on the front page of a major section of the newspaper of record of humanity that led my wife and me to understand that there were people who really wanted her to be, first of all, famous and appreciated for the wonderful thing that she did, this act of resistance directed at Zionists in the occupied heart of Al-Quds, but that ultimately she was very likely to be one of the people around whom a great deal of energy would be expended to see that she would be brought back out into circulation, in other words, to be freed. And in October 2011, our worst fears were fulfilled, became real, when, in the context of a transaction to which we were bitterly opposed, but about which we said nothing in public other than to say that she shouldn't have been included, the Shalit deal resulted in 1,027 convicted Palestinian terrorists, more than half of whom, and the Israeli government at the time, which is the government of today as well, never disclosed this to my fellow Israeli citizens, more than half of whom were murderers. She was the only one who was released to go to Jordan. She was deported to Jordan. Jordan is where she came only a year or two before carrying out the massacre. She's a Jordanian. She was 21 when she orchestrated the massacre at Sbarro. It was not her first terrorist attack. She had made another sortie into Jerusalem just 10 days earlier, armed with an exploding beer can. It sounds like a bit of a joke. It wasn't intended to be a joke. She planted it inside what was then the supermarket in the basement of the Mashbir L'Tzarchan. I think there'll be people who will remember the Mashbir in its original location on King George. It still exists, but it's in a different place. She placed the beer can on a shelf among other cans of beer and walked out expecting to create a massacre, and was bitterly disappointed when either it malfunctioned or the explosion turned out to be in the wrong place. But it was simply inspiration for her to come back to her handlers in the Hamas organization and to say, "Don't give me a piece of garbage like that again. I need a real bomb." And when she walked the human bomb, the young man carrying the guitar case on his back, on the 9th of August, on that day when the Israeli police and the security authorities in Jerusalem knew that there was a walking bomb heading into Jerusalem that day, knew it, but never disclosed it publicly. On that day, she knew that she was going to be doing something of much greater impact, and indeed, its impact was horrifying. So she was released in October 2011. I'm also not going to spend much time dealing with the awful events leading up to the Shalit deal itself and its aftermath. And I'm really going to pick up the story in February 2012, some 2.5 months later. Ahlam Tamimi arrived to a rapturous welcome. I have it on video, and I pull it out on Tisha B'Av. Tamimi was received in Jordan in the way that pop stars, perhaps, or very successful or popular politicians might be in a more normal society. And from there, it was upwards and upwards for her. What changed from my perspective was that in the first week of February 2012, and I was by then following her closely through the Arabic media, as I do right up until today. I don't read Arabic, I don't speak Arabic, but my good friend, Uncle Google, gives me a constant translation into languages that I do understand. She appeared in a series of promotional advertisements announcing that she was going to have her own television program. And though we're all sitting here far away from Jordan and in a place where names like CNN resonate a lot more strongly than names like Al-Aqsa or Al-Quds, the two TV networks that belong to Hamas, I can assure you that the impact of Al-Quds and Al-Aqsa are phenomenal, not only because of the fact that you don't know it, but also in absolute terms because of the reach of those networks delivered by both satellite and what are called internet repeater stations. In other words, streaming sites that you've probably never heard of. Some of them you have, YouTube was one, where they take videos of live TV programs and distribute them into the willing and eager hearts of fans all over the world. She had an enormous audience once that TV program got going, and it was all about terrorism. It was about singing the praises of terrorists. It was about creating a morale boosting environment in which the Arab and Islamic and not only Jordanian audiences around the world could express their support and be encouraged by the tales of heroism and dedication of people who walk into pizzerias and onto buses and into theaters and into supermarkets in order to murder Jewish children. It was a big success. What it did for me was persuade me that I couldn't sit with my arms folded while this woman's career took off. And I explained to my wife that I felt I needed to go to Washington, and I did. And in Washington, a very short, very short visit, I, together with a lawyer who joined me and has continued to be part of our efforts through all of these years, wonderful man, went to see the Justice Department and included among them the FBI. And it ended up that I spoke to a gathering of some 20 or so senior officials in the Justice Department in Washington, explained to them essentially two things. Number one, my wife and I will not allow the murder of our child, among the many others murdered there that day, to turn into a mere statistic. But given that my wife, whom I married in New York right after going there to study at Yeshiva University after I finished law school, had American citizenship, a law that somehow no one knew about applied in the case of her murder. And that law says that if there is an act of terrorism that takes place outside of the United States involving a weapon of mass destruction, and where there are American victims, the United States government takes upon itself both the responsibility and the privilege of going anywhere in the world in order to seize the perpetrator of that murder, of that terrorist attack, and bring the perpetrator to trial in the United States under United States law. And as I explained to the investigators and prosecutors at the Department of Justice and the high-level officials of the FBI, it had never been applied once in Israel, despite the very many American citizens who had been murdered over the years. My daughter, I said, was an American citizen. This is the law, and I'm calling upon you to apply that law and to go after this woman who lives in freedom, hosting her own TV show every weekend in nearby Jordan, an American ally, and a country that has, and has had at that stage for quite some years, an extradition treaty with the United States of America. I want you to go after her. It was a good meeting. I was assured afterwards by several of the key people there that if they could, they were going to go after Tamimi. And I came back and told my wife that I fear that we're going to have an uncomfortable few weeks as the American government goes about seeing to it that justice is done. But I was naive, and it took 5 years of silence from the authorities before we received a phone call in March 2017, exactly 5 years later, telling us that a group of DOJ and FBI officials were on their way to Jerusalem. They wanted to meet with us. They have some issues they want to discuss with us, and would we make ourselves available? It was really quite an unforgettable meeting. I'm not going to stretch this out. They came to tell us that charges were being unsealed. I don't know how many people in this call know what unsealed means, so I'm going to just be a little pedantic and say the charges had already existed since 2013. We were now in 2017. 4 years had gone by, and the charges had been kept a secret. A secret to such an extent, ad kedei kach, that I found it necessary to go to Washington a year earlier in 2016 and give testimony before the House Oversight Committee on National Security, where I was politely listened to as I explained what I considered to be the failure of the Justice Department in going after this woman, and without giving us any explanation. Well, with hindsight, I learned in 2017 that in fact they had done everything they needed to do. They had gotten the order from a federal judge. They had begun negotiating with the Jordanians about having this woman handed over for extradition under the 1995 extradition treaty to the United States, and that the Jordanians had rebuffed them again and again. And that at that point in March, actually the 14th of March 2017, the United States government had decided that they wanted to make the charges public. And at the same time, and not so incidentally, they were saying to us, the families of the victims, and I'll explain who the victims are in a moment, that we're also in the court of public opinion, as it was explained to me. You're in the court of public opinion, meaning that in some way, which was never articulated, and perhaps I'm not quite getting it right, but I think I am, it's necessary to move American public opinion so that the politicians can make the hard decisions needed to put the heavy word on our dear and reliable and strategically invaluable friends in Jordan, and ask them to hand over this loathsome murderer of Jewish children, who has meanwhile been turned into, by any measure, a global celebrity. A lot about that meeting continues to rankle in my mind. There were things that weren't said that I've since learned. Perhaps the most important of them was that, on one hand, the American authorities absolutely knew where Tamimi was. As a matter of fact, they know where she is at this moment. They've always known where she was. She has never taken the trouble to hide her whereabouts, nor was there any need. In Jordan, she lives in a totally supportive society, not only supportive because she's one of us, so to speak, but because what she did has made her a hero. And there'll be undoubtedly some people in this group who will be thinking to themselves, and I hope that you'll even ask about it, it can't be that all the Jordanians think that this woman is a gift from God. And my response to that is that I read the Arabic media every day, every morning, except on Shabbat, because I need the internet for this. And as I said, I need my Uncle Google to translate the Arabic into English, but I do this every day. And I have not yet seen a single analytical piece, a single news report, a single piece of writing coming out of Jordan in which someone says, you know, we may be doing something monstrous here. We may be supporting something ugly and hideous that speaks very, very badly of our own society. I haven't seen anything like that. It hasn't existed. It doesn't exist. Her support in Jordan is phenomenal. There's no politician anywhere in the West, no public figure anywhere who has that kind of wall-to-wall support in that person's own society, the kind of support that Tamimi has in Jordan. We also discovered that there was no reward on her head, and that was the first encounter between my wife and me on one hand, and the State Department of the United States of America on the other. Why the State Department? Because perhaps counterintuitively, the reward that applies to people like her who've been named to the FBI most wanted terrorists list, and she was only the second woman ever to be added to it, unless you think that it's a list of 25,000 people. There are 27 people on the FBI most wanted terrorists list. They really are the most wanted terrorists, and she's one of them. The rewards for their capture, typically in the range of $5 million, come from a unit of the State Department called Rewards for Justice. Again, I'm not going to spend any time. Trust me that I could speak for an hour just about the phenomenon of the Rewards for Justice program inside the State Department. Let me just say that when I became aware on the morning after meeting with the American law enforcement officials who came to Jerusalem to tell us about the unsealing of the charges against Tamimi that were going to take place 3 hours after our meeting in Jerusalem, I became aware also that she was the only person on that list, the only murderer on that list who didn't have a reward on her head. And I got back to one of the people who was in the group that had come from Washington to tell us that she was now the subject of an open, unsealed federal charge. And I said, hey, the reward, I guess you guys forgot. And his response made it clear to me that not only wasn't it forgotten, but that the Justice Department people had made great efforts to try to get that reward in place, and that the address was the Rewards for Justice Department unit in the State Department. And I understood that it would be in my interests to try to make contact. And I did. And I contacted the woman who was the person in charge of the unit and left her a detailed voice message because she was out that day. And evidently she's been out every day since then for the last more than 4 years. I've never had any response from the Rewards for Justice people at the State Department. In the fullness of time, 9 months after the charges were unsealed, just like making a baby, 9 months later, a $5 million reward materialized, which was notified to me by a different official. This isn't the time for settling accounts, or one day there will be, but notified me that indeed there is now a $5 million reward. But by that time, it had become terribly clear to us that the whole concept of reward had no place in the story, because everybody knows where she is and has always known it. I've got photographs of her apartment, the inside, the outside, the view from the window, the door plate on the front door. All of this is in the public domain. That was the 14th of March, 2017. 6 days later, the Jordanian kingdom punched back with the charges announced, and with some very minor reporting of the fact that the Jordanians had not yet agreed to extradite her to the United States as required under the 1995 treaty. Jordan's highest court convened, and I'm told by the American law enforcement people that there was no American present in the court when this took place, which is strange. The highest court in Jordan declared that the 1995 extradition treaty signed by President Bill Clinton for the American side and by King Hussein for the Jordanian side was invalid. The treaty was invalid. By then, I had already learned that not only had the treaty been treated as valid right down through the years, but that Jordan had handed over fugitive terrorists every time they'd been asked by the United States government to do so. Something about this woman, Tamimi, made that ordinary course of dealings no longer applicable. You don't need to be very smart or involved in the case to understand that what made her case different was that she is very open about who she set out to murder. As I've said, it was Jewish children, and she diabolically succeeded. This, of course, made her phenomenally popular. And you can't extradite phenomenally popular people if your kingdom is somewhat unstable and you're beset with people who want to overthrow you or undermine you or have people feel that you're not quite the king that they want to have. So on the 20th of March, 2017, we were in a new world. Jordan had said, there's no treaty. We're not going to hand her over. We would love to hand her over. They didn't say this. They didn't say we would love to hand her over. But they, in fact, as I say this, I realize I haven't clarified something that is really fundamental to what I'm saying now. The determination of the validity of the treaty was made by the Jordanian court. The statement by the Jordanian government that accompanied the determination of the court was nothing. They never said a word. Haven't said a word until today. Not the king, not Jordan's ambassador in Washington, not any public official. There's one exception I'm debating with myself whether to deal with it. I'll just mention it in passing. The one exception to that, and only speaking in Arabic to a domestic audience where I think he didn't realize he was going to be quoted in the media, is the current foreign minister, a man by the name of Safadi, who has now said on 2 separate occasions, we have no intention of handing this woman over to the Americans, rest assured. So by and large, the Jordanians have just acted as if, did something happen? Nothing to do with us. And in the meantime, here are the Roths and everybody else who's interested in seeing justice done, waiting for some brave official. It might be a politician. It might be an office holder in one of the government departments of the United States of America, rising to his full or her full height and saying, we call upon Jordan to honor the treaty with the United States and hand this abominable woman over. That speech has never been made. And in fact, most of the efforts that my wife and I, through our pushing and writing and speaking at 3 o'clock in the morning to whatever audience is prepared to listen to us, what we've aimed to do is to create some awareness among Americans that the United States government, which ultimately is the party that can make this extradition happen, it needs to simply tell the Jordanians, has been remarkably passive. And I'll say something here at the risk of burning off my friends in this audience who think that the Trump government was the greatest gift that the Jewish people have ever had. I have a lot of friends. I take no political view in the United States. I'm not an American citizen. I've never voted in the United States and I never will. But the Grand Canyon, the chasm between what my many friends who think and still say today that the Trump government was by far the best we could possibly have had, and the reality is absolutely huge. Nothing happened to our advantage to advance this case. In the entire 4 years, the indictment was issued under Obama, it was unsealed under Trump, and now under Biden, we're trying to finally get somebody to do something about it, to pursue it. But it hasn't been an easy journey, and the big heroes of the Jewish pantheon, the people about whom such warm speeches have been made, and I permit myself a tone of not small bitterness in this, those people, the Secretary of State and the various kippah-wearing individuals around the President of the United States, what they've done to help us can be summed up by my putting up my fingers and making a circle in front of you. And I'm sorry to be blunt about this, but if I'm not blunt about it, one of the major points here will simply be ignored. The fact is that we've gotten no help at all from anybody in that domain, and we continue to be in a situation where we're constantly trying to win over political voices so that the executive of the United States, not of Jordan, will speak out and say to the Jordanians, who are the 3rd largest recipient in the world of American foreign aid, we want her on the 4 o'clock plane this afternoon. That's what should have been said in March 2017. and March 2018, and every day since then. I also want to take a moment to focus on the argument that there is no treaty because there's some legal flaw. I'm going to be a little bit cagey, but I really have big news. We haven't been passive, and we haven't just confined ourselves to talking to people in the middle of the night. We've been taking some steps. And one of the steps that we've taken in the very recent past is that we sued the United States in December. And we essentially won. We reached a settlement which resulted in the government of the United States handing over to us some very important, what we consider to be very important documents. I'm not going to say what they are now, and I'm not going to say what their effect is, other than to dance around it a little bit because we want to announce this in the appropriate way. But the effect of those documents is to put the failure of so many officials of the United States and the utter failure of the Jordanians to live up to their treaty obligations into a different light. It's all wrong. They shouldn't have done it. They should not be continuing to do it. And we are going to keep pushing until we can have that woman in the hands of United States officials in chains brought across the Atlantic to stand trial in Washington. There have been some other developments in the last few weeks. I'm skipping over a lot of these, the fine detail of our case. The government of Jordan, as you may know, has just in the last 8 days declared itself, in my words now, having narrowly escaped a coup. And for anybody paying any really serious attention to what's going on there, it's of course probably got nothing much to do with a coup, and probably a lot more to do with popular resentment against one failure after another in the way the government of Jordan works. Jordan is not a lovely place. Some of you may have been there. I don't say that it's not a pretty place to look at, but it's unfree. It's a place where there is no democracy. It's a place where there is no access to information. It's a controlled environment. And economically, it's a basket case. And if it were not for American foreign aid in the billions of dollars every year, Jordan would be another in a long list of failed Middle Eastern states. The fact that it's not so is often confused when it comes to who are our friends and who are our opponents in the Middle East. There's no question that everybody regards Jordan as America's friend. No question at all. The king is well respected and well regarded in Washington circles. The Jordanian ambassador to Washington is beloved by practically every Jewish leader in the United States that I've ever spoken to. On the other hand, if you would have noticed, no more than 10 days ago, the Anti-Defamation League issued for the first time a report about Jordanian school textbooks. And lo and behold, it turns out that Jordan's phenomenally high rate of anti-Semitic bigotry, which has been known since another Anti-Defamation League study of a few years ago, that the school textbooks in Jordan, not in Palestine, not in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, promote anti-Semitism, explicitly inculcate attitudes of hatred towards Jews. And we have a problem with Jordan. The biggest problem we have is that there's a real failure to understand what's actually going on there and who's our friend and who's not. Now, I'm not out to get Jordan, and I'm not out to poison your minds. I'm really just trying to tell my story of extreme frustration at the failure not only of officials in the United States government, but also officials in Jewish organizations in the United States. I won't go into any details on that because in the summer of 2020, as a result of one of the major Jewish organizations giving a platform to Jordan's ambassador to the United States, and having done it in an appalling way, in my opinion, an appalling way, keeping her shielded from any possible critical questions. As a result of all of that, my wife and I wrote to every one of the major American Jewish organizations, all of the members of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, and a small handful of others. And we got significant support. And we put out a press release, and I'm not going to expand on any of that because it's a fact. We are a consensus issue. But quietly, and I permit myself to take this view at 3:43 in the morning on a Monday morning here in Yerushalayim. Quietly, I want you to know that there are some significant Jewish American organizations who either refused to join us in making this call on the United States to obtain justice for murdered Jewish American women. One of the women is my 15-year-old daughter. And there are others who just ignored us. It's the silence, I can tell you, that is more crushing even than when people come forward and say, well, resistance, and if you were in their shoes and one person's terrorist is another one's freedom fighter. Trust me that I've heard every version of that fractured and really quite sociopathic outlook on life. So we've gotten to the point where there is a coup which has been defeated in Jordan. We've gotten to the point where we have documents in our hands that clearly indicate that the treaty is valid. There's a number of other developments, one of them not so sympathetic. In March, Interpol, some of you may have tracked this at the time, Interpol, which is in fact, I'm not going to say what it is because everybody knows what Interpol is, except that most people have it quite upside down. Interpol dropped Ahlam Tamimi from its red alert system, its red notice system, which is an alert system to notify governments that if you turn up at the immigration desk in an airport anywhere in the world, the immigration officers are going to see names come up on the screen who are wanted in one government or another. Ahlam Tamimi was on that list right up until the first week of March of this year. And now she's not. I'm not going to analyze it for you. I can only say that there's much more powerful people than my wife and I who are trying to exert their will on this case. What I can say is this. We're only two people. We have friends. We are comprehensively, our story is comprehensively suppressed by the mainstream media, not only in the United States, it has to be said, but also here in Israel. There's a great deal of granular detail that I'd be glad to share with people over a drink here in Yerushalayim. But that's the bottom line, that our story, if it weren't for our social media activity, which for us means Twitter, I don't go to Facebook, which also means writing wherever anybody will publish op-eds, and talking to people, as I say, at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is how we've created and continue to try to create awareness of the extradition, of the thwarted extradition of the mass murderer of the children inside the Sbarro pizzeria. All of the normal channels where perhaps brave American politicians get up on some public platform and not literally but figuratively beat themselves on the chest and say, I demand. No one has ever made that speech in the case of Tamimi. And I'll go a step further and say that for all the efforts made both by me and by my wife personally, but also through friends like Sarah Stern of Emet, a wonderful organization, a very fine lady, in trying to win over the support of members of the Congress, with a single solitary exception, we've never once gotten a voice from the Democratic side of politics. And I'm not going to dwell on the notion that I've already put in front of you that this isn't about politics and I don't vote and from it is apolitical. It's just appalling to us that an issue which is 100% justice and which is all about victims who were all of them Jews and who died al Kiddush Hashem because they were Jews in the heart of Jerusalem, and that an issue like that doesn't arouse enormous passions among American Jews in general, and certainly among American Jewish leadership in particular. And look into my face and trust me as I say, because I'm too tired to make this up. It's unforgivable. It is incomprehensible. And it will change, but it might only change after a significant number of people will be embarrassed and we will make ourselves persona non grata. One of the ways, perhaps the most important way, that I keep myself sane is what resulted during the 7 days of Shiva almost 20 years ago, during Chodesh Av, after the massacre and after losing this delightful daughter, Malki, the oldest of our daughters. We created a foundation. Well, to put it more carefully, we arrived at the idea that we didn't want anybody to turn this precious soul, this wonderful life, this empathetic Balat Chesed, this wonderful 15-year-old girl with a wonderful future in front of her, into a statistic. We have a youngest child. The youngest of our 7 children was born absolutely perfect and beautiful, but at the age of a year was blind and brain damaged and remains until today a person of 26 years old who lives with us and will always live with us, who has no communication with the world and has very little very little control over anything in her body, and is profoundly retarded. Malki adored her little sister, whose name is Chaya Elisheva, adored her, used to carry her into her own bed, into Malki's bed, just to give her that feeling of closeness, that there's somebody who loves her. Got nothing back, which is, of course, pretty much the classic definition of what chesed, what Maaseh chesed are about. You do, you give, whatever you possibly can manage with your own body, with your own personal efforts, and you don't do it because you're going to get something back. That's chesed. Malki was a princess of chesed at a young age, and she infected the people in her circle with the same values that she had. We decided that the best way to remember Malki was to create an organization that would carry forward her values by supporting families like our own family, who are raising a child with serious special needs in their own home. I generally take about 2 hours to tell the story of why there's a need for the Malki Foundation. And it's not a story that reflects wonderfully well on the country where we live. We're passionate Zionists. We're here in Israel, raising our children in a Torah environment, wonderfully proud of our grandchildren, living here in Yerushalayim, living the dream. But that doesn't mean that life is a bed of roses. And one of the ways in which we've learned that that's the case is in our many battles to try to get more for our child with special needs. And though we won, for all practical purposes, we won before Malki's murder, we're now doing that same sort of battling via the foundation in order to give other families who perhaps don't have the background that we have. My wife and I are both lawyers, trained as lawyers at least. My wife never worked as a lawyer. Passionate about pushing away the idiot bureaucrats who think that they know better than we do about how to look after our child. We do this in very practical ways for several hundred Israeli families. Overall, it's been several thousand over the years. And what the Malki Foundation does, in broad terms, is it does one thing, and it does it in 2 different ways. The one thing that we do is that we empower families who have a child with special needs so that they get more from the system, and that so that they can ensure that the result of their love and their affection and their care for their child in their own home produces the best possible result. We do that by providing equipment through a partnership with an organization that lends equipment to them, standers, walkers, toilet equipment, things that are expensive and that are hard to buy and that you need to change every few years as the child grows. And which is done on a much larger scale, we fund therapies. We're not a hospital. We don't offer medical therapies at all. But the therapies that we do support, physical, occupational, speech, horse, and water, all of those therapies, we've provided tens of thousands of them by funding therapies that have been rejected by the Kupat Cholim mechanism, the arm by which Israel's medical budget gets spent on ordinary people. Every Israeli is a member of one of the 4 health funds. And if you look at the way they operate, it's heartbreaking when it comes to children with special needs. And we are the last resort for families who are not able to get what they need from the government. But that's happened in tens of thousands of instances. So that's the chesed side. We do these things knowing that doing chesed, which often means doing chesed with members of the Arab parts of Israeli society, makes us quite different from the people who blow up pizzerias and buses and schools. We're not 2 sides of the same coin. We're not similar to one another. We're worlds apart. We're miles apart. Malki couldn't be more distant from the woman who blew her up. That doesn't stop journalists from presenting it quite differently, quite the opposite. And the other thing that we do is we write. We write and we talk. We have a blog. We do op-eds, whatever we can possibly do to sensitize people to how badly the war against the terrorists is going. And in particular, how badly Israel's case is being perceived in important parts of the world. This isn't the place for me to make a speech about that. In fact, this is the place for me to stop and to say, I very much appreciate being able to tell you these things. I want to urge everybody who's watching, please allow me to finish this sentence and then I've stopped. To go to the blog site, you see it on the screen now, top right corner of the homepage, you'll see a link to a petition. We have roughly 14,000 signatures on the petition right now. It's a petition that addresses the Secretary of State of the United States of America. It was written with Pompeo in mind. He came to Jerusalem in November. My wife and I, out of our own pockets, paid for a 1/3 page advertisement on the front page of the Jerusalem Post, calling upon him under the words, Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shalt thou pursue. He's a religious man, as we're accustomed to seeing. We were comprehensively ignored, and in fact have never heard anything from him or from his staff. As we heard nothing at all from the previous Secretary of State. We hope for better this time, but we're not building any plans around it. But our efforts to see justice done are totally dependent on people moving the public opinion needle in the United States, helping us create awareness of what's going on here. I want to state the obvious when I say we're not looking for a tax break. We're not looking for a building to be named in somebody's honor. We're not looking to get somebody out of prison. We're looking for an indictment of the Department of Justice of the United States, an effort in which the FBI was deeply invested. We want to see that process move forward to its logical next step, where the fugitive murderer who has never denied for a moment what she did and has never concealed her whereabouts is brought to the United States, put on trial in Washington, and hopefully convicted. I appreciate very much, Rabbi Tendler, since you're the only representative of the Beth Jacob community that I've spoken to, appreciate your supportive, helpful, cooperative, encouraging approach. It's really meaningful to me. And I hope we meet at a lot of weddings in our joint families in the future. And thank you very much to everyone who's come along here tonight. I'm sorry, this afternoon. What are we? You're
evening. Yeah.
Yeah, good. And please visit the website of the Malki Foundation. Please visit thisongoingwar.blogspot.com, and please give us your support in whatever way you can. But mostly, please sign the petition and ask your friends to do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, Rabbi Feldman is on and would just like to share a few brief words. Here he is.
Mr. Arnold, it's an honor to meet you, and thank you for depriving yourself of sleep once again to bring Malki's case and to bring the issue of justice to attention of a few more people here in America. And I pledge myself to do what you asked tonight and to do, please God, more than that. The fact that you are as level-headed and as continued faithful as you are in the face of such unmitigated evil and such an unbelievable lack of response on the part of people who claim to believe in justice. Really, it's very inspiring to me to see you as you and your wife as energetic as you are and as forward moving as you are, as creative as you are. There's no doubt, even if God forbid in this world there isn't justice, you know, and I know, we all know that there is justice in the world. There is a God, and Madame in a Kavikom, and there will be justice ultimately, but we want to see it in this world, and we want to see it as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your commitment to us, because you obviously believe in us if you're sharing all of this with us, and we hope to rise to the occasion. I very much appreciate it, and please, on behalf of the whole shul, convey to your wife as well, not just our sympathy, but our love and our support and our encouragement, and the fact that you inspired us to take action about this and many other things that demand justice. Thank you.
If I may just interject one request, people have left chats here. I can't see them. The best way to communicate anything, whether it's criticism or support or ideas, thisongoingwar@gmail.com. And I would appreciate it if people would just let me know, give me some feedback. It always helps, even when it's critical. thisongoingwar@gmail.com.
Very good. Are you going to daven at Netzach Hama and then go to sleep, or what?
Not in that order.
Okay.
It's Rosh Chodesh. If I go, anyway, that doesn't matter. It sounds too lighthearted if I give you the answer that I have on my mind. But thank you for the suggestion.
Okay.
By the way, I hope your father as well. I met him when I visited the shul the last time. We would have been 30 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's doing well. They're now in Yerushalayim.
Thank you. I guess we've come to the end.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your attention, everybody. And
Thank you very much. We're very grateful that you shared of yourself in this way.
my pleasure. Thank you. So good night.
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 Night. Bye-bye.